Hey peeps, hope you're well. Good to see you. Thanks for popping by. I'm going to get right into it today and talk about this superstition. And I think I promised at some point last year I was going to go through all the Siouxsie albums, and I probably will over time. I've already talked about Peep Show. I talked about the first Creatures album. So those of you who watch my channel with regularity, you know how I feel about Siouxsie and the Banshees. They're one of my all-time favorite bands. Last summer, and I posted a video about this. Last summer, I opened up a box of records that I hadn't been through in over 2 decades or something, 15, 20 years old. And I discovered a lot of Siouxsie and the Banshees records, and this was stuffed in there. So I took out all of the 12 inches associated with this record, and I just ripped it. I ripped all my vinyl to digital this past week. Basically all my Superstition era stuff, and I'm going to talk about it. I've listened to this album many times in my life, and I literally just ripped this the other day, and it's fresh in my mind. And so I think this is a fun album well, any album that you've had in your life for over 3 decades is fun to talk about, I think, because an album can mean something completely different to you after listening to it for 34 years as it did the first time you heard it. And so, as I do with most old records, I'm going to talk about my experience with this album and the singles contained on it. So, I really like this record. It's taken me a while to let it grow on me. This record came out in 1991. I want to say it came out in the summer. I could have looked that up, but whatever. I'm pretty sure it came out like late spring, early summer of 1991, like June-ish. I have a very concrete memory of this coming out around my 19th birthday, which would be June of 1991. So this came out at a really, interesting time. You're 19 years old, 18, 19 years old. You're trying to catch up to the world, and your brain is a sponge, and you're listening to all kinds of music. At least I was. And I had already been a Siouxsie fan for several years up to that point, at least 4 or 5 years, I think. And Peep Show was the album that came out before this, and that's generally my favorite Siouxsie album. After listening to this a couple days ago and ripping it and listening to it with much detail, I have to say that maybe, arguably, this would be a close second to Peep Show. Listen, this is my channel. I get to have my opinions. I know there are plenty of people out there who will disagree with that, but this is an opinion. There are no facts when it comes to art. We have preferences and opinions. My opinion and my preference is that Superstition is one of my favorites, right there behind Peep Show, I think. I really like this album. I didn't love it when it first came out, but it's grown on me over the years. One of the things I didn't like about it, excuse me, when I first heard it in 1991, was I was so caught up with acid house and rave and techno and house music and ambient music, and I was way into that at that time. And so anything that was remotely traditionally rock music, I kind of shunned, I dismissed a little bit. And even though I did like this record at the time, I felt like it fizzled as it progressed. Like I thought it started really well, and then it kind of, I don't know, it kind of fizzled toward the end. Now, I've listened to this over the years without prejudices and without expecting all things to be electronic like I did in the early 90s when I heard this. And I remember when I first heard it thinking, Kiss Them For Me is a great song. Why didn't they do more of that for the album? Electronic, grooves. Kiss Them For Me had some remixes on the 12-inch that I thought were cool. Why didn't they do a full album of that? That was my immature expectations of it back in 1991. In in the years that have succeeded this album, sorry for my throat. I keep clearing this thing. I just ate lunch, so maybe that's part of it. Sorry, I know that's gross, but part of what I've learned to love about this record is that it was, in a lot of ways, this was a very traditional Siouxsie and the Banshees album. In fact, Kiss Them For Me is the one song on this album that doesn't really fit. In the years since, I've listened to this album many times since 1991, and in the years since I've listened to it, what I've learned about this is that Kiss Them For Me is the first song in the album, and I feel like that was the big hit. That was the electronic song. That was Siouxsie and the Banshees kind of embracing this new rave culture. But then once that track is done, the following 10 tracks are like classic Siouxsie. I feel like Kiss Them For Me happens, and then the band is almost saying, like, okay, that song is out of the way. Now let's get back to business. And the rest of the album flows. I would argue that Kiss Them For Me doesn't really fit. It would have been cool that that song was a single unto itself and not included on the album. And plenty of bands did that, especially back in the 80s and 90s. But Siouxsie and the Banshees never really did that. When they had a single, it was always on the album. Almost always. Not always, but almost every time. But Kiss Them For Me is kind of the one song that sticks out. It doesn't really flow with the rest of the record. That song happens, and then the next 10 are traditional kind of rock and roll Siouxsie songs. There's some songs that are a little lower tempo, more ambient, but her album's always had that. So it's funny, like in 1991, I felt like, why can't the album be more like Kiss Them For Me? And now, 34 years later, I listen to it, I'm like, why can't the album be less like Kiss Them For Me? I mean, not that I have a problem with that song, but I just don't think it fits with this album. Think about it. Listen to this record and tell me I'm wrong. That Kiss Them For Me is the one song that doesn't sound like anything else on the record. Not that that's a bad thing. I just feel like it is what it is. They put the big electronic, or for these guys, it's electronic. They put the more electronic hit at the beginning, and then they get on with business after that. And again, it doesn't hinder the experience, but when I listen to this album, I can't help but kind of listen to the record. It's hard for me to not skip over Kiss Them For Me. It just doesn't really flow with the rest of this album. My favorite tracks on this record, I mean, man, there's not a bad song on here. I can't think of any Siouxsie album that had a bad song on it. I can't think of any of their 12 inches that had a bad song either. Siouxsie and Banshees were another great band where their B-sides would rival the greatness of their album tracks. Sometimes their B-sides were better. That's the strength, I think, of Superstition and Peep Show, too, is that their B-sides were so good. Absolutely worth picking up their 12 inches from this era. Their B-sides were fantastic. But I think my favorites on this album are Drifter, Shadow Time, which was one of the singles. Great song. I'm really sorry about my throat here. I apologize. Let's see. Softly. Softly, honestly, is one of their best songs, I think. One of their more quiet ballad type songs, one of their more ambient songs. Really beautiful stuff. But yeah, if I had to pick a couple, it'd be Drifter, Shadow Time, I think, and Softly. The Ghost in You, the last song. I mean, Shadow Time was a single. But the non-singles are so good on this album. One of the singles, Fear, was a single here in the United States. I don't know that was released in Europe. I don't think it was. The two singles that were released in Europe were Kiss Them For Me and Shadow Time. And here in America, the two singles were Kiss Them For Me and Fear. Shadow Time was not released here, which was a mistake. But I think, I think in hindsight, Geffen, the label they're on here in America, I think they figured Fear is like an up-tempo rock song, and it probably would fit better on radio here in America than Shadow Time would. Even though Shadow Time is a far superior song, in my opinion, one of the greatest songs Siouxsie and the Banshees ever did. And I'll talk about the singles a little bit here in a minute. But yeah, Superstition, I love this record. It's really grown on me. When I first heard it, not so much for the reasons I just explained, and now I hear it, I'm like, God, it's such a good album. I'm so happy to have this. And this is, if you're curious, this is the original UK issue. I know I have a US pressing of this album as well on Geffen, and it's pretty much identical. It's got the same inner sleeve. The only difference really are the labels. This is again, these are the labels for the UK edition. The US edition, as per all Geffen records, just had the Geffen logo on it, like, that black label with like a silver David Geffen logo in the middle. This is a much better label presentation, in my opinion. I can't really compare the pressings. I don't think many people are going to care. I think the US pressing sounds just as good as this. And I'll probably press that US pressing at some point in the future, but I chose to record the UK edition. And it sounds great. I think this got reissued. I'm pretty sure this got reissued as a double vinyl package at some point in the last 4 or 5 years. I think Universal did it. I've never heard a Universal repress that I liked. I've thought every Universal reissue I've ever heard has been garbage. So I would assume their reissue of this is no better. Don't assume because this got reissued on double vinyl, that one's going to sound better. Don't assume that. In fact, this record was pressed in 1991. Just from experience and having bought records for 40 years of my life now, I would assume that this single record, this UK edition, is better, sounds much better than that reissue does. I would just assume that. I think people assume because things are 180 gram and they're pressed on double vinyl rather than single vinyl, it just automatically sounds better. No, especially in the case of Universal, absolutely not. Universal does not. They just don't press things well. When they press things to vinyl, they use digital sources. I don't want to get into that whole discussion, but to me, listen, when you have a record, I've been listening to this record for 34 years, and after I recorded this, I like to briefly listen to a digital version of the same album and pick out differences. And you can call me crazy, but when I listen to the digital version of this, I hear things on this vinyl version, this original UK vinyl edition, that I do not hear on the digital version. The digital version sounds louder and maybe punchier, but it doesn't have the detail that this has. I'm not saying necessarily one is worse than the other, but they do sound different. And when you're used to hearing a record on vinyl, like this album with me, I would rather hear this. I'm just used to hearing this version. Now, with new records, I don't buy new records as much anymore because I don't mind listening to the digital version because most records now are all digital anyway. They're all sourced from digital sources, so it doesn't matter. But to me, these old records that are sourced from analog sources, I would prefer to have these. They just sound different, and the detail's different. And there are differences. After I recorded this and listened to the digital version, there are absolutely differences, and you can't deny it. So I prefer this. I will always prefer this, I'm sure. So, yeah, of the singles on here, Kiss Them For Me was released here in the US and the UK. It came out on a couple of different versions in each country. It came out on like a gatefold sleeve. I'm not going to show all the 12 inches. If you want to see those, I'll link you to the video. Earlier last year, I opened up my Siouxsie collection, and they were all sitting there for everybody to see. So I will link you to that video if you want to actually see those. But I'm just going to show the album here. But Kiss Them For Me came out on a couple of different versions. B-sides were great. The remixes were okay. There's a youth remix of Kiss Them For Me that I think is pretty good. I think it's called the Catholic mix or Catholic mix. That's probably my favorite remix. There's an ambient mix of Kiss Them For Me. The mixes are pretty good. The B-sides are excellent. Fear of the Unknown was a 12-inch here in the United States. Again, I don't think it was released in the UK. It had a bunch of remixes on it, really, and it was Junior Vasquez doing the remixes. I've never been a fan of that single. I think the remixes are kind of lazy. You get like 5 or 6 remixes of Fear. They're all by Junior Vasquez, and they all sound almost exactly the same. And they're very brief. They're very similar. They're very monotonous. It just seems like that single was chosen to be a single by the record company and not the band. And I have a hard time believing that Susan the Banshees chose Junior Vasquez to do the remixes. I think that was a record company decision. I could be wrong, but having been a DJ and having worked in the music business for a long time, the 90s was a time, and the 80s was a time too, where record companies would choose a remixer to remix a single, and the record company would choose what the single was. So I don't know. I have a feeling Susie and the Banshees did not choose that to be a single in the US, and they probably didn't choose Junior Vasquez to do the remixes, I would guess. The remixes are very good, in my opinion. The best single from the album is Shadow Time, I think, and that did come out in Europe as a 12-inch single, and it has a mix called the Eclipse mix. It's basically just an extended version. Not really a remix. When I think of a remix, I think of someone who comes in and reproduces the whole thing, maybe makes it more electronic or makes it less electronic. They basically make it more their own track. The Eclipse mix is more of like an extended version. They add a couple of minutes of instrumentation and things, and it is a bit of a mix, but I would call it more of an extended version. The B-sides on Shadow Time are fantastic. I think all 4 of the B-sides you find on the singles from this album could have easily been on the album, in my opinion. In fact, I think some of the B-sides are better than some of these album tracks. Like, I think the weak spot on the Superstition album has Gotta Get Up. It's a decent track, but I don't know. When you compare it to the B-sides, man, I think the B-sides are all better than tracks like Gotta Get Up. Not a bad song, but I think the album might have been stronger had they used one of those B-sides. But I think Shadow Time absolutely is the best single from this record. And that's my spiel on Superstition. Yeah, I've been listening to this off and on for 34 years, and now that I'm listening to it 34 years later, I think I like it more than ever. It's just grown on me. I think I wasn't ready for it when it first came out in 1991. My brain was somewhere else. I was so ensconced and obsessed with electronic music that I was disappointed that it wasn't more electronic. But now that I listen to it in 2025, it's hard to believe this has been out for 34 years now, or almost 34 years. Now that I listen to it in 2025, I think I'm glad that it's not more electronic because that would have meant maybe Susan and the Banshees were, not being themselves. And that's what I love about this band. They always just kind of got on with business and did what they wanted to do. And in many ways, this is a very classic, traditional Siouxsie and the Banshees album, and it's absolutely one of my favorite Banshees records. Superstition. Go listen to it again. Why not? You've got nothing to do, right? All right, I'll talk to you next time. Bye.